Okay. Now I think we can start. Okay, Professor Prakash. Okay. Good afternoon and good evening, everyone. I would first like to thank everyone for your presence, and of course, you, Professor Prakash, for accepting this invitation. And I think we can start because it's 5:37 p.m. and I think it's more than the prearranged time, and I think that it's very important for you. Would you? And then, Professor, we are very happy, and we have the joy of receiving a great and generous partner of DECLEN, because you, Professor, is an enthusiastic of the colonial discussions, particularly in the taking into account the Indian reality, which is the subject that Professor, among others, of course, that is involved at Queen Mary University in London. Professor, I'm sure that your ideas, your lecture will be something unusual for us because we don't have this perspective, and of course, thought-provoking. Then feel free to speak as long as you like, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Guilherme Borges, and Judge as well. But tonight we agreed to drop some of the formalities, which is good. But I'm very happy to meet you over Zoom, and also the guests here today. A couple of whom I know, and I've sort of instigated to participate in this meeting as well. But most people, I think, I don't know them. So it's my pleasure to be here with you and to share with you some of the recent experiences and reflections that I've been having on the problem of caste and caste system. I will talk for about half an hour to 45 minutes, and then hopefully we can have some time for questions, because I think some of the more intricate details and discussion can be had in a better way with questions and answers rather than just a straight presentation. But it may be necessary to just lay out some of the groundwork. Now, is it possible we can have the slideshow, or?
Yes, okay. Are you sure?
Is it? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Are you looking?
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Let me get more large. Okay. I think it's better now.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you. So if we can, yes, that's perfect. That's the slide I wanted. So so the point of departure is the recent spread of laws and policies on caste discrimination that have been taking place in various Western countries, but particularly the United Kingdom, where I'm based, and also especially the United States, which has sort of woken up to the reality of caste discrimination among the South Asian or Indian or Hindu community, which is based there. But when I say woken up to the reality, I mean it in a sort of sardonic way, because obviously I'm one of those people who takes a critical perspective with respect to whether or not there is any substance here with respect to the claims that are being made about Indians having transplanted their very famous caste system from India to different spaces where there is an immigrant community in different parts of the world. I think it's also interesting to note that although Indians are spread more or less everywhere in the world, it's very particular jurisdictions which have taken on the task of beginning legislation and to create policies against caste discrimination. So it's not that widespread. For example, there's a large Indian community in Portugal, but we don't hear about any move to prevent caste discrimination in such a country. The same for France, the same for Germany, the same for Italy. So it seems to be more the Anglospheric countries which are either putting into place certain measures or agitating for certain measures to be put into place. And that might be an interesting reflection point for the later discussion as well. Somebody like me comes out of a sort of bittersweet experience of having challenged the proposal for a law on caste discrimination in Britain. And on the right of the slide that you can see here is my book from 2015, in which I made an argument against the necessity for legislating against caste discrimination within the context of the British anti-discrimination law. I think Mr. Mukesh Nakar is here with us today. He was one of my co-conspirators during that battle against a variety of different actors, from civil society organizations to parliamentarians to central government bodies and agencies like our Equality and Human Rights Commission. So we were challenging a whole chorus of voices which were clamoring for the enactment of a provision on caste discrimination within the equality legislation in Britain. So that's my point of departure, really. I didn't know much about caste before the prospect of a caste law became real in the United Kingdom. I was taking some interest in the study of India, in the Indian diaspora, especially in Britain, because I'm also trying to specialize in problems of cultural diversity and law. And much of that focus has involved a study of the South Asian diaspora in Britain as well. But it seemed to me that caste was something that was really not a major point of focus until very recently. And it's only in 2010 when the Equality Act, which is our main anti-discrimination law statute in Britain, was passed, that we thought that there was some kind of first reference point actually in British law with respect to caste. Of course, the British, when they were in India, did a lot of things with respect to caste, and I will turn to that background, which is actually the more relevant thing for us today to discuss, because we're quite interested in colonialism. So from the UK, we jumped to California, and there's been this very quite prominent case against Cisco Systems, which is one of the tech firms in the California Silicon Valley landscape. And the case hasn't concluded, so it's still in the California courts, and we will see what happens eventually when the courts rule about the claim of caste discrimination that's been made by one of the former employees of the company Cisco. But very much more recently, in fact, I think earlier this month, there was a new ordinance passed at municipal level in Seattle, which seeks to include caste in the local anti-discrimination policies there. And if I'm not wrong, I think that ordinance is not yet in force because it's still awaiting signature by the mayor of Seattle. But it's quite possible that it will come into force. And that has spread shockwaves through the, particularly through the Indian American community, which lives in the United States, and which parts of which have been against the enactment of such laws, which they fear will be used to target them. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened, because in California, just I think last week, there was a new proposal to enact a bill which would amend the California civil rights legislation to also include caste discrimination as one of the protected categories in California. So this is spreading. Of course, we've already had over the last few years a number of universities which have been amending their own discrimination policies to include caste as part of those policies. There's a whole number of universities. I actually lose count now. There are universities in California, Brown University, etc., etc. There's a whole number of universities which have done this, and there is some litigation in California actually, which challenges the way in which the policy on caste was adopted by one of the universities there. So we'll see what happens in due course, because certainly people are not taking this lying down, and there are going to be challenges to this legislation. There'll almost definitely be a challenge to the Seattle Ordinance. The Cisco case is being defended quite heavily, and I suppose the California bill will also be challenged, as are the university policies from place to place. So we will see what happens, because now the American courts will be full of controversies about whether or not caste should in the first place be the subject of anti-discrimination laws and policies. So we'll await to see what happens. But this is something I've been trying to follow quite closely, particularly because of our experience in Britain, and I see something quite similar developing in the United States, especially. There are murmurs that something might be happening in Australia, where there's a kind of review of the anti-discrimination law going on there, and it's possible that something could happen in Canada. So again, you see a very much a kind of focused approach on the Anglospheric countries, which seem to be very, very prepared to go down this road and to extend their existing anti-discrimination laws and policies. But we will see what happens. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the arguments that I want to make is that none of this would be happening in the United Kingdom, United States, or elsewhere if it was not for the Orientalist and colonial background through which India underwent, and my claim, my larger claim, is that the conceptual background to the enactment of anti-discrimination laws and policies is really to be found in the way in which Europeans, and particularly the British, talked about and described Indian society. And my other claim is that when they talked about and described Indian society and culture, they did not provide or their descriptions did not match the reality of the Indian culture and society, but rather matched or emerged from the kind of background framework from which they were thinking and writing. And of course, the two are quite separate, I would like to claim. And in order to do so, first of all, what we have to do is try to distinguish between the phenomenon of colonialism and the phenomenon of Orientalism. I want to keep the two distinct, and of course, they should, I think, be kept distinct. If you look at Edward Said, who is the famous scholar of Orientalism, his focus was very much on the colonial period, and I think since his writing, people can be forgiven for thinking that without colonialism there couldn't have been Orientalism, and colonialism was a major player in the Orientalist project. But Said himself also accepted that Orientalism existed both pre and post colonialism. Right? So it existed both before and after colonialism. And of course, that's true, because if we look at Orientalism as the Western experience of the Orient, as something that captures that whole Western experience and presents an account of it, then of course there is a much older basis for the Western ideas about the Orient, upon which the colonial thinkers, writers, merchants, missionaries, and so on were able to build. Right, so they were able to build on a background that already existed. So Orientalism as such was not new when colonialism took off, and as Edward Said and others have pointed out, the continued descriptions of places like India and other places in the Orient, which emerged after the dawning of the Age of Independence, will also testify to the fact that Orientalism outlasts the period of formal colonialism. And so, if Orientalism is the Western experience of the Orient, the caste system is an entity in the Western experience. In other words, the caste system is an experiential entity for the West. It captures the part of the experience that the West has of India, and as an experiential entity, it has no real equivalent out there in the world. Next slide, please. So in the formulation of this experiential entity, as I was trying to suggest earlier, the background ideas in Britain were very important for building of the notion of the caste system. And in particular, what is very important is the commonly held ideas from within Protestant theology. Ideas such as Indians having a false religion, Indians being subject to the rule of priests or the Brahmins, in other words, priestcraft, the religious ideas about the kind of laws that the Indians were practicing, and in fact, even the search for law in India as a kind of religious law is really motivated by the Protestant background through which or with which the British colonizers had come to India. Now, one of the peculiar aspects of those Protestant accounts is that, of course, they carried with them the whole baggage of previous polemics, both against Catholicism and Judaism, and they mapped onto those structures that already existed, those polemical structures that already existed, their experience of India. And that's part of the reason they were able to generate ideas like the Hindu religion, which is dominated by priests or the Brahmins, and Hindu religion is basically a creature of priestcraft. The priests hold out certain doctrines as though they were true, but they are patently false. But they oppress the population by compelling them to follow those false accounts of God's will for humankind, etc., etc. I mean, those of you who are coming from Catholic countries, which I think many of you are, will be pretty familiar with the kind of kind of diatribes that Protestants have leveled against Catholics over a long period of history. And so this is, and particularly during the Reformation period. And it's interesting that the colonization of India was happening really in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. I mean, not immediately afterwards, but once there was a kind of settled corpus of understanding about what the Protestant Reformation was, how Protestants differed from Catholics and Jews, and so on and so forth. So it's with this background that they went to India and were able to map their experience of India onto that background structure. One of the other remarkable things, of course, with the elaboration of the idea of the caste system is the strong missionary role in its construction. And I put construction here deliberately in quotation marks, and hopefully we'll have occasion to talk about what that construction entails. But briefly, what I want to say about construction is that construction could be spoken of in a constructivist sense. So you might say, well, there is talk or description of a certain kind, and what that does is it gives rise to a certain reality in the society, right, or in the real world. But that's not the kind of construction that I'm referring to here, because I'm saying that the existence of the caste system is really only in the accounts that were made or constructed about the caste system by the Europeans, and there was no corresponding existing reality of the caste system out there. In other words, the claim in the research program within which I work is that there is no caste system, right? The idea of the caste system is constructed, but there is no corresponding caste system out there. But we'll have more occasion to refer to that problem later on. By the middle of the 19th century, it seems certain that certainly the English-speaking missionaries, and perhaps you could extend that to the Lutheran missionaries as well, were pretty much agreed that the caste system was a sacred institution. In other words, they took the religion which they described as Hinduism, and they associated it with the social structure which they thought it gave rise to. And so there was a direct link between the religion and the social structure made. And one of the things that enabled the missionaries and others to claim is that because this is a false religion, it's indelibly stricken with a kind of immorality. And that's why the caste system becomes a signature for the immorality of the Indian society and culture. Next slide, please. Actually, yeah, on the left-hand side, you can see a book by one of the famous missionaries, Alexander Duff, which I'll maybe I'll have occasion to talk about in a bit. So, okay. So in the 19th century, you see this sort of really, major elaboration of ideas about the caste system, the religion of Hinduism, the corruption of the Indian social structure, and so on and so forth. These ideas over a period of time, and also already within the 19th century, began to be secularized and adopted by the social sciences. So the social sciences also hold today that, of course, India has a caste system. It has all kinds of faults. There's endemic discrimination as part of it, and so on and so forth. So what you get is the dropping of the explicitly religious or biblical language, but you get the retention of the basic structures of description which attended those earlier descriptions, and they get secularized into the social sciences. And so even in the 19th century, when you look at thinkers like Marx, later on you can take somebody like Durkheim or Max Weber, and so many writers of the 20th century, they all take up this theme as though it was a kind of scientific description of the Indian society and culture. And of course, my claim is that it was no such thing. And one of the things that betrays to us is that, and of course this is a larger point, it goes much beyond the issue of the caste system, is that there is a kind of mutual dependence of the social sciences and Orientalism. They both reinforce each other, they both depend on each other to elaborate descriptions of human society. And as I was trying to already convey, today, of course, we have a pretty standard way of describing India and Indian heritage people, according to the earlier descriptions of the caste system. Now, it's not to say that there isn't variation about the caste system, right? If you look at, let's say, the Durkheimian school, Durkheim often disagreed with colleagues of his or his followers with respect to the exact nature of the caste system, how it is to be appropriately described, and so on. And you can take any particular school of thought, which is dealing with, the study of India, and you'll get a kind of variation, right, between them, within them, and so on, with respect to the exact contours of what the caste system is, what it does, how people within it behave, etc., etc. So I'm not here to challenge that position, but none of them challenge the very existence of the caste system, right? Which is the sort of, I suppose you might say, the radical step that we're taking within the context of our research program. Now, having said that, there is recently, around, I think, the year 2001, the former chancellor of the University of California, Nicholas Dirks, came up with his book, The Costs of Mind. And within that, he presents a kind of post-colonial account of the caste system. So what he says is that actually it's difficult to claim that there was a caste system in India prior to British colonialism, because Indian society was structured along so many different indices of difference and of identity and so on, that it's almost impossible to say that there was a uniform caste system which dominated the entirety of the Indian society. And there were so many different types of social structures that Indian language, that you could use to describe Indian society according to the different Indian languages, and so on and so forth. But he makes a crucial move by arguing that when the British came, and when the descriptions of Indian society and culture began to emerge as a result of British colonialism, you see that there is a sort of formation of a caste system. So if you describe it as a constructionist idea, then you might say, or constructivist idea, you might say that although he disagrees that there was a caste system in place when the British arrived, he thinks that there was one after they left. Right? So it's as though the colonial mechanism gave rise to a social structure which wasn't there. Within Bala Gangadhar's research program, to which I've been referring and of which I'm a follower, we challenge this, right? We say, well, you cannot have just merely by the agency of a colonial state an entire social structure coming into being. That's just impossible unless you grant very extraordinary powers to the British colonial enterprise. So how is it possible that they could have come up with an entire social structure with which all Indians identified and changed their behavior accordingly and so on and so forth? It's just not possible, right? We think that Nicholas Dirks' hypothesis is not really tenable. And the better hypothesis is to say that there never has been and there still isn't a caste system as a feature of Indian culture and society. Now, so far, what I've been referring to is the enterprise of colonialism, because I've been talking broadly about the kind of descriptions that the European colonizers gave to their experience of India, and it gave rise to this larger idea of the Orient, and as a subset of that, it gave rise to the experiential entity that we're referring to as the caste system. But what has all this got to do with colonialism, right? Because I'm almost suggesting that this is all happening independently of colonialism. So what is all this got to do? Where does colonialism come into this? So we need to talk about the character of colonialism. Now, today, if you look at, and here I'm really following Balagangadhar's hypothesis, which you can find in this book, Reconceptualizing India Studies. If you look at the terms of description that emerged during the colonial period, in particular, problems like the civilizational superiority of the colonizer, for example, it's difficult to say that there isn't a continuity between what was accepted during the colonial period and what's accepted currently. In fact, it seems like there is a continuity in the terms of description, right? So if you take the civilizational superiority of the colonizer, you will still see that the way in which social sciences are conducted by Indians is that they accept the presupposition of the superiority of, let's say, British culture or European culture, Western culture, and so on. And it's according to that that they used to orient themselves, and they continue to orient themselves. In that sense, actually, you can say that, or you can ask the question, why is that the case? And you can also say, or you can ask the question, isn't that a problematic state of affairs? Right? Because if there is a continuity from the colonial period or since the colonial period right up to now, surely that's going to be a very problematic situation. Because what we're saying is that the colonial experience, while you might argue was legitimately being followed as the norm during the colonial period, it stands against reason that it should continue to be followed. So it's very problematic, and one has to ask questions about how that could be. So what Balagangadhara does is that he tries to draw an analogy between colonialism and education. Actually, the underlying question he's trying to answer is, why is colonialism an immoral project? Can we consider colonialism to be an immoral project? If you look at some conservative writers in the 19th century, they used to argue against colonialism on grounds that it was an immoral project, whereas progressive thinkers like Mill, even John Locke, Karl Marx were arguing that actually colonialism is a progressive event in world history. Today, you see a flip of that position, right? So you see conservative writers, particularly in the West, arguing that colonialism was at least partially a positive event in world history, even if they don't accept that it was completely so. Whereas leftist thinkers, liberal thinkers, and so on tend to go the opposite way. So there's been a kind of flip. One of the things that tells us is that there isn't this sort of clarity about why colonialism is an immoral project. And that's the underlying question which Balagangadhara is trying to answer. And as a first step, he argues that we can look at colonialism as an analog of an educational project. There is something which resembles an educational project within colonialism. But it's different from an ordinary experience of education, because although an ordinary experience of education alters one's perspective of the world, let's say, for example, if I learn about photosynthesis in my primary or high school, I can never look at a plant in the same way again, right? But I can defend that change of view because I can say, well, cognitively, the account of photosynthesis is, has some kind of cognitive merit, right? It makes sense, right? It conforms to some kind of scientific criteria and so on. But colonialism doesn't do that, right? Colonialism imposes a particular set of ideas, an account, which isn't cognitively defensible, but yet is absorbed by the colonized, right? And the question is, how is it absorbed by the colonized? And Balagangadhara says it's imposed by violence. The reason why it instills itself in the mind of the colonized is because it's imposed by violence, because it doesn't have any inherent cognitive value. And of course, violence can be of all types. It can be psychic violence, it can be physical violence, and so on and so forth. And what he refers to as an outcome, he calls it colonial consciousness. He says colonial consciousness is the inability of the colonizer to access their own experience as a result of the intrusion of the colonizer's account. But at the same time, they have an inability to really access the colonizer's account because they don't share the experience of the colonizer, right? Because the colonizer is from a different culture altogether, and they don't have any access to that culture, they are prevented from having access to the colonizer's account also. So they're in this sort of in-between position where, which Balagangadhar terms is colonial consciousness. Next slide, please. Now, we can go deeper into the role of colonialism and connect it to what was happening with the caste system idea, right? Because one of the things which is absolutely true today is that the caste system idea has not only been popularized in Western countries and in other countries, but Indians themselves have accepted the terms of description of their own society and culture, which the colonizer produced. So how did that happen? Now, this is a very tentative set of hypotheses that I need to really deepen. But my sense from a preliminary kind of survey, my sense is that there are multiple modes through which the colonial enterprise extended itself into the Indian society in order to transmit its idea of the social structure which the British thought was existing there. So one of the first or one of the important agencies being used was the expansion of the missionary school system. And there you see a much more direct connection between what Balagangadhara says, about colonialism as an educational project and the actual schooling of Indians who went through the missionary schools. And the missionary project was, of course, very much premised on the idea that Hinduism is a form of idolatry, and that, in one of the descriptions of, I had the book cover of Alexander Duff, who was one of the key designers of the missionary school system in the, let's say, second third of the 19th century onwards, together with colonialists like Thomas Macaulay and others. It was almost as though there was some sort of mission in place where they thought we have to critique Hinduism, and in order to critique Hinduism, we have to critique the caste system as well, because the caste system is what holds what is the cement that holds the bricks of idolatry together in this, to sort of, if you take the analogy of a building, it's more or less literally the words of Alexander Duff in justifying his approach to missionary education in India. Secondly, you also have a set of census surveys, and there is a cover of the report, which was the census report, which is the first one. For the first extensive one, it wasn't actually absolutely the first one. There were earlier census reports, or let's say population surveys over time. But this was really the main or the major move into the census exercises, which continued every decade from that period right up to the 1920s or 20s or 30s in India. And so they were, India was divided according to different localities, and this you see here an example of the census which was carried out for the city of Madras. There was another census which was carried out for the Madras presidency, and so on and so forth. Accordingly, different areas of India were divided up and surveyed. And within the census surveys or the census reports, you see extensive discussions of caste and the caste system. So there was an effort to classify the Indian population according to some method or some system that the British already had in their mind. And of course, when they went out there in India on the ground, they found a whole host of anomalies which didn't fit their preconceived ideas of what the caste system is. But they nevertheless retained the caste system as the, let's say, the kind of superstructure of the Indian society. And they tried to squeeze in the different types of population groups that they came across when doing these surveys. And so the caste system idea is never really given up, as we know, because we still have it. But instead, what happens is that the data is made to fit the presuppositions which go into the incipient ideas of the caste system that the British had already begun to formulate. A third mechanism is the legal system. And of course, this intensifies. In fact, in the earlier years, you see that the legal system that the British instituted is, let's say, relatively passive and, in fact, even supportive of caste structures, because they think that that's the kind of social structure which ought to be supported in India, and every group which consists of the larger caste system, or of which the larger caste system consists, has its own way of doing things, has its own dispute resolution mechanism, and so on, and they should simply be allowed to continue with those. But over a period of time, you see the generation of case law through which different, let's say, depictions of the immorality of the caste systems get to be depicted. And this then carries on into the 19th century, and there's a kind of corpus of jurisprudence which also is inherited by the post-independence Indian state, and lays out some kind of rough framework for them to think about the kind of social structure which they have as Indians. Of course, the introduction of mass politics in the early 20th century really intensifies the attitudes, or spreads the attitudes towards caste and caste system much wider into the Indian society, because you get a much wider set of people who participate in this politics. There are also politicians who are appealing to caste sentiments and so on. And this process, of course, in the post-independence period has intensified massively since then. And as part of that, or really perhaps even as an independent category, you also get the emergence of Indian reformers who accept that the Indian caste system is a kind of corrupt form of social organization, and that something must be done to either destroy it or reform it. And so you get different sorts of responses among the Indian reformers. But the presupposition in their thinking is really the acceptance of the dominant account which has been produced by the British. So in all sorts of ways, you might say that the Indian reformers became the embodiments of the kind of colonial consciousness that I was trying to describe earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I've been making allusions to the post-colonial Indian state, but here we have to focus on that. As I was also trying to allude, that the Indian state then takes on the burden of caste and the burden of either mitigating the effects of the caste system, or to, in ideal terms, eliminate it altogether. And so the Indian constitution comes to have provisions against caste in it. You begin to get a system of reservations in jobs, in university places, also for political office, parliamentary office. So a system of reservations based on caste status, which are directed to the, let's say, representation of those who are deemed to be on the lower rung of the caste hierarchy. You also get legislation on atrocities, caste atrocities. It's not earlier called caste atrocities, but eventually the 1980s version of that legislation is referred to as caste atrocities legislation. Earlier versions are referred to as civil rights legislation. Now, this happens, all of this happens over a period of time, and certainly from the early post-independence period onwards. But one of the things that's interesting is that the discourse which attends caste and, the agitation which attends it in terms of, the extension of reservation schemes and ideally the elimination of the caste system by the destruction of the social structures of Hinduism and so on from Indian society, becomes extremely acrid from the 1960s onwards. And this is where you see really the intensification of an identity politics which is based on caste. And one of the things that I think we should be making a connection with is what was generated at that point in time and how it's intensified even more since then in India, and how the terms of that debate are now transplanting themselves into countries like Britain and the United States. And this is why I think that the attention to the colonial period is extremely important, because it's the colonial framework which lays the groundwork for the way in which we have come to think about caste and caste discrimination today, and is resulting in pretty tense situations occurring also in places where Indians have emigrated to, such as Britain and the United States. So I'm going to leave it there. I hope I've said enough to provoke some kind of discussion and questions. And I welcome your questions very much.
Let me stop just a minute, Professor.
The gentleman on the last slide there was B.R. Ambedkar, who was very famously described as the father of the Indian Constitution. Of course, he didn't write it in order to discuss provisions of the Constitution and so on, but he was certainly one of the lead actors. And of course, he's more famously known also as the defender of the untouchables in India.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very interesting. I have no idea about this construction of the morality of the caste system by the Western. It was very, very different from me. And I think we can go on to debates. And of course, I will take advantage of the event management. And I will ask you something about the legal system, because it's very, very close for me and more easy it's easier to take an idea. I read a very interesting text of your professor that is called Culture Through the Law. I don't remember the exact name, but about the idea of culture and the interface between law and anthropology. And you borrowed, for example, a notion from Liuling that was law job. And this idea for me was very, very specific and particular. If you, Professor, could go a little deeper in this idea, I would appreciate it, because one of the problems in recognizing the cultural difference between the West and the East lies in the centrality of the idea of law, ignoring the fact that in some cultures, the law is just one role among other regulations, religious, social, cultural, and so on. Albeit from a non-state perspective, how to look at a diverse experience and community without this centrality, because for the Brazilians, it's very important when we think about the indigenous regulations and things like that. If you don't mind, Professor, to go deeper.
Yes, of course. I mean, I've been thinking quite a lot about this question myself, actually. I couldn't really describe it in that paper that you mentioned. I'm not so proud of that paper. I think it needs a
No.
lot of work and substantiation much further. But the current, let's say, hunch, I won't call it a hypothesis, but a kind of hunch that I'm working with is that if you look at the world's cultures, it's the ones which came out of the Semitic religions, so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which I think have produced some kind of fundamental link between law and society, and they've postulated that law is indispensable for order in society. As far as I can see, I've been looking particularly at the countries of Asia, or the cultures of Asia, with respect to this question. I don't really see that the same kind of thinking has has accompanied the developments in those societies. So if you know today, when the British went to India, for example, they found something they refer to as Hindu law. And of course, that is also one of the constructions that you might say, that's also a kind of experiential entity which the British created. And as part of Hindu law, they also said, well, the Hindu law also has a caste system. The caste system is underpinned by Hindu law. And the evidence for that is in all kinds of different texts, which the Indologists refer to, and which are broadly brought under the rubric of Dharma Shastra literature. But I am yet to be convinced that the Indians were thinking in anything like the legal terms that let's say, the Western culture and the kind of development it arose within the Western culture as a result of Christianity or the kind of thinking about law in Judaism or Islam. I'm very doubtful that India had something like that before contact with the West and before contact with Islam, of course. I don't know if your question was pitched at this particular level. I mean, because I could read your question in a completely different way and ask whether you meant that whether caste discrimination is the kind of problem that ought to be solved by law. And when you look at the kind of justifications which are currently made, certainly in the countries of immigration of the Indians, like the United Kingdom and the United States, the justification for why law should be used is not very clear at all. Either by members of the dominant societies, like, let's say, the English or the British, or the people from the immigrant societies who are agitating for a caste law. None of them seem to be able to justify why law is the appropriate means of intervening in this process. Some of them say, well, law will teach the Indians how not to discriminate, right? And some Indians will say that, right? You see that happening very recently in Seattle as well. That law must be used as a means of dragging people to the courts and teaching them a lesson, because they all practice caste discrimination, but they hide it when they do. Well, I'm not really sure if that justifies that makes caste discrimination a kind of law job. Of course, it also begs the question what caste discrimination actually is, because if you talk in terms of discrimination, you might say that that's an intervention of a normative framework which itself is Western, right? And it necessarily entails the claim that Indians would inevitably fail discrimination tests because of the way in which the description of Indian society and culture has been structured through Orientalist and through the agency of colonialism. And you can see that comes out in the responses of those people among the Indians in the countries of emigration who challenged the proposals for caste legislation, because they know they feel, I mean, they can't explain it necessarily, but they feel that they will be the first ones to be targeted by these laws. And they certainly don't feel as if they need to be taught a lesson by having legislation in place. Because they all deny that there is such a thing as widespread discriminatory practices and caste discrimination and so on, right? I think quite genuinely, I don't think that they're being disingenuous or dishonest when they say that. Yeah, so that would, I mean, it would be a kind of two-part answer. I don't know which one exactly more suited the question you were asking.
Oh, for me, what was very interesting, because I read your text, I had an idea, but now it's clear. Thank you very much, Prakash. I don't know if anyone have any question to ask to Prakash. Yeah. Professor Dell would like to ask something.
Thank you, Guilherme. And first of all, I'd like to thank the professor for attending our DECLEN meeting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know. I think he is freezing.
Yes.
It's better now. Yes.
Yeah, it's better now. Okay. I would like to also congratulate the professor for the lecture, and at the same time for the paper that I consider one of the most interesting readings that I did until now this year. I must confess that I was impressed by my ignorance on the subject of the subject. It was quite really interesting. Well, I'd like to talk about a little bit about culture and comparative law. And reflecting on your paper, I was able to verify possible approximations with the cultural approach of comparative law. In this sense, I would like to know from the professor what the limits you understand that the culture imposes to the work of the comparatist. And if we have time, I don't know, I also would like to know if like the comparative approach, the cultural comparative approach of comparative law, you understand that if it's possible or impossible to carry out a legal transplant. So
Cool.
I have these two questions. And once again, thank you very much for being here today.
You could look at culture in one of two ways, right? You could look at it as, or the culture question in one of two ways, because you might say, if we could argue that culture provides some kind, it does provide some kind of limits to the way in which a culture functions, and the way in which it elaborates its experience of other cultures as well. That's what Orientalism is, after all. If we agree that Orientalism is a product of Western culture, then we also say, Edward Said says, that there's a inherent limitation in that, because of the cultural constraints which go into producing the kind of discrimination, the descriptions that it does, right? So there's inevitably a limit when you begin to think in cultural terms about societies. And then those limits would also impinge onto ideas of law and descriptions which entail law, whether they're of our own society or another society. And those present limits as well. On the other hand, you could say, well, there's an opportunity here, particularly for a comparative project, because once you begin to appreciate that the limits of a particular type of description or a set of descriptions, or some kind of meta level description, which Orientalism is, once you realize that they are cultural products, you can actually begin to understand through the limits how to do comparison, right? Because you can begin to open up questions about, well, if this description, which has been, let's say, widely accepted or universalized because of the dominance of the West and so on by many other parts of the world as well, and even by the cultures about whom they were, then you can open up the questions and argue for different approaches, different ways of doing research, right? So if you say that, well, the caste system is not a description of Indian culture and society, then you have to say, well, what is that, right? But it's only by, let's say, to use the terminology of this Indian writer who talks about provincializing Europe, it's only when you provincialize the conception of the caste system that you can begin to open up the question about, well, if it's not the caste system, what does India have, right? And that leads to so many different research agendas, because you have to really think completely outside the box, and outside the received notions of what India is and isn't, right? So that's why I say it's also an opportunity. And then in the legal field, it opens up the kind of question that I was trying to raise with respect to, by responding to Guillermo's question, which was, well, if this is one entry point into the problem. If the idea that the Indians had some type of law is a construction of Europeans who produce descriptions based on their interpretation of the Indian sources, then we can even ask, we don't only have to ask, oh, well, were those interpretations accurate? Do they conform with our current day understanding of Indian languages and so on? But we can even go deeper and ask, well, if they found law in those descriptions, can we agree with them today, right? So can we not open up the law question as well and ask the question, how is it that a society like India could have continued in an orderly fashion over millennia or whatever without law, right? And that would be quite a radical question, because all the societies we know today presuppose that law is an essential part of social order, right? Whether it's inherent, whether it's indigenous, or whether it's an imported idea, everybody more or less agrees to that, right? Nobody disputes the necessity of law, right? But once you begin to do that, you begin to see that there could be other ways of thinking about order in society, right? It doesn't have to be founded, a society need not be founded on law, right? So that's why I say it's an opportunity as well as a limit. It's almost like looking for opportunities by identifying the limits.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I don't know if anyone have another question.
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, Sanjay.
How is caste defined in the law cases in California and in the UK? What's the definition of it?
Yeah, excellent question. There isn't one, and there's certainly no authoritative one, because we haven't had a court ruling. The one law. Okay, so I'll talk about the British example first. In Britain, they were not able to come up with any definition of caste. After a particular case went through the courts, and they still couldn't come up with a definition of caste. In fact, the judges accepted that there is no agreed scientific description of caste. And they left it there, while they also agreed that our reference to ethnicity in the discrimination law can include reference to caste as well. So you can potentially bring cases of caste discrimination in the British courts based on that. Okay, so that was one way of thinking about it. A couple of years after that, in 2017, 2018, the British government did a consultation on whether or not there should be a caste law. Within that consultation, the consultation paper itself, the one that invites responses, accepts that there is no agreed definition of caste, right? Whether for legal or non-legal purposes. So that document, official document, also accepts that. If we move to the United States, the proponents of the or the let's say proponents of the case, or the plaintiffs, right? Those people who brought the case, which is actually the formerly named California Department for Fair Employment and Housing, right? Today it's called CRD, I think maybe Civil Rights Department or something like that. It's not clear to me if they have a coherent definition of caste. It seems to me that they have something like the definition of caste, which is based on the Encyclopedia Britannica. So caste is a rigid system of social hierarchy based on endogamy and I can't remember the other component, but yeah, it's sort of the typical ingredients that you get in accounts of the caste system generally. So they put those together and said, this is what caste is. They've done a pretty similar thing in the Seattle Ordinance. And in fact, the Seattle Ordinance is perhaps the clearest statement of what they think caste is. And it's something like a rigid form of social organization based on hierarchy and endogamy, something like that, right? So, and which legally is very easy to fault, which is one of the reasons I think that the people who are advocating the insertion of caste clauses into a variety of laws, particularly in the United States, have no intention of them ever being activated. Because, for example, if I was a lawyer in the Seattle case, the first thing I would attack is the claim of rigidity. You know, I would say, well, it's not rigid because so many people marry out of their caste as well. So how can you say it's rigid? So it's legally, it's not flawless. It's actually quite faulty, right? And what the interesting thing for the purpose of this seminar is that they all derive their ideas of what the caste system is in the colonial period, in the early colonial period.
Thank you.
Oh, I thought he had a follow-up, but no.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah. Do you know the work of Oliver Cox on race, caste, and class, where he gives a definition of caste?
Not really. I don't know it. But one of my co-authors in the special issue, to which I sent the link, he goes into it far more deeply. I think he refers to Cox as well.
Yeah.
Because you're right. I think that one of the things that Cox tries to do is link caste to race. If I'm
yes,
not wrong.
And he gives a definition of caste as an endogamous and hereditary system of organization along lines of superiority, inferiority, and gives some of these criteria. Now, the reason I'm asking is this, obviously, that if in Western societies the legal system takes the title of fighting caste discrimination and there's no clear definition of it, then this opens the way to put a lot of discrimination under the cover of caste, racial discrimination, for example. If you don't have a clear definition, then any lawyer could say, oh, if it is about intermarriage, why don't we look at intermarriage among white and black people, and argue that there's little intermarriage in certain sectors of society, especially when it's combined with income, and so that is caste.
Yes.
A lawyer could argue that, if
yes.
there's no clear definition of it.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether in these cases, those type of arguments have been used. I don't hear you.
No. We are not hearing. We cannot hear, Professor.
No.
No.
Can you hear us, Professor Prakash?
Yes. But we are
Oh.
not hearing. I think this is the internet. Not yet. No, we cannot hear you, Professor. We can see, but not hear. Not yet. I think maybe now.
Yes, you can hear me?
Yes, now we can hear.
Yeah, actually, you're okay. I will
It's not continuing. Maybe now. No, it's blocking the audio.
Should I type my question, my answer?
It's a time to edit the answer. No, we cannot hear, Professor.
Any better, is it?
Now, yes. I think now
Oh,
it's
really? Okay, I've
perfect.
taken out my headphones. Right.
Okay.
So this relation between caste and race is a very problematic one. And one of the things it tells us that we don't have any knowledge of the caste system or of caste actually today, you know. So let's say the dominant trend has been to conceive of caste as a subset of race. And you can see that during the colonial period as well, as my colleague Martin Farek writes in his contribution to our special issue. And it's very, I suggest people read that. It's very, very fascinating as an account of what the dominant thinking during colonialism. So caste was regarded as a subset of race because caste was also regarded as an outcome of a white race merging with the darker races of India. And the outcome was a variety of different castes and also a hierarchy of castes. And that is partly why today's thinkers, or thinkers since that time, have found it fairly plausible to make some kind of link between caste and race. And you see it in contemporary lawmaking efforts as well. In fact, in the United Kingdom, the legislative proposal was to the effect that caste should be regarded as part of the definition of racial group, right? So our anti-discrimination law, the broader category is racial group, then within that they have ethnicity, race, color, nation, and nationality. And they wanted to add caste to that. So you can see that the higher level category is race and caste becomes a subset of that. In fact, they're trying to do pretty much the same. They have been trying to do pretty much the same since the 1990s in the context of the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination has been trying to encourage everybody who listens to it to adopt caste as a subset of race, because the convention doesn't have an explicit reference to caste. It has a reference to descent. And the committee wants people to consider descent to cover caste and caste discrimination as well. So again, you can see the similar sort of dynamic operating there. Now, when you look at one of the recent contributions by an American journalist who wrote a book on caste and race, she argues the opposite. She says that caste is the superior category, and she says caste, the original form of caste is in India, but the Nazis had it, so the Nazis used a caste system as well, and the Americans in their program of racial segregation and racial hierarchy they also manifest a type of caste system. So for her, the broader category is caste and caste system, and the subordinate category is racial discrimination or racial distinctions. I have some preliminary thoughts about this. I mean, one of the things that this problem, as I tried to say earlier, it underlines for us is that we don't really have any knowledge of what caste is or what caste system is today. And so actually it's a failure of 200 years of scholarship, right? That they've come up with all kinds of weird hypotheses and theories and so on, but none of them really matches the kind of, social realities that they try to, attempt to describe. So my own approach would be something like as follows. I would say that race is really a kind of difference among human beings that makes sense in the Western culture. So it's an attribute of, the I don't want to say the way of thinking because it sounds very glib, but one of the outcomes of the gestation of ideas within the West has been to produce conceptions of race as a marker of human differences. I don't think all societies do that. If we reference back to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, it's really instructive to examine some of the early discussions that they had at the United Nations level about the convention itself. So the Secretary General of the UN at that time wrote to a variety of countries asking for their laws and policies on racial discrimination and so on as part of his effort to get the convention mechanism going. And representatives from a variety of countries like the League of Arab States or the Ethiopian government, they wrote back and said, for us, race is not really an issue. I think we think it's more of an issue for these Western, for your countries or for Western countries. And so you shouldn't really be asking us whether we have laws and policies concerning, race and racial discrimination, because we don't really consider it as the way I prefer to think about that is to be generous to their responses as given, and to consider them as betraying something about the kind of cultural background from which they were operating, which means that, or I like to think that it means that from within their own cultures and societies, they don't see race as a relevant classification of human beings. Whereas in the West, this has been the case for a very long time, right? So again, if we provincialize race as a conception of difference among human beings and situate it within the Western culture, I think we'll make much more progress. Right? Rather than trying to universalize ideas of race, which actually more appropriately belong to the Western culture and make sense in the Western culture, right? So, for example, recently we had a report about racism, misogyny, etc., homophobia within the Metropolitan Police in London, in the United Kingdom. And the report described what it saw as institutionalized racism among the police. So for a culture like Britain, right, or the Western culture, referring to racism, which is based on the conception of race and therefore racial differences among human beings, it makes complete sense to talk in those terms, right? no matter how much we say that we don't believe in race or we don't believe in, racial hierarchy and so on, it seems that the West continues to keep churning out ideas about race on a constant basis, right? It's as though something about race makes sense to British people or Western people, whatever, right? It's how they do, even if they disagree about what defines race, because there isn't one definition of race, right? But it is a kind of salient difference for the West, right? Whether it's for the West, when it's describing its own society or other societies. So that's what I would say. So we lack knowledge of caste, and I think in a way, we also don't really have a handle on what race is as a cultural product, or as a cultural way of thinking, culturally situated way of thinking.
Okay, Professor Sandy, I don't know if you, but thank you, Professor. Professor Priscilla, who was with us a little while ago, and she's professor of human rights. She left one question, and if I read for you, Professor, she, taking account this idea of the Convention of No Discrimination, she asked, maybe more general, what is the possible attribution of responsibility to India in relation to the caste system and the perpetration of human rights violations? It's her questions.
What is the possibility of attribution to India of human rights violations, right?
Yes.
As an outcome of the caste system, presumably. So, I mean, I would just sort of repeat what I'm saying. I would say that it's inappropriate today for us to conceptualize India as an entity, as a cultural entity which has a caste system. It's even harder to attribute whatever human rights abuses you might be seeing in a country like India to the caste system. Since we don't know what the caste system is, you can't actually give it some kind of agency, or describe some events either as an inherent part of it or as an outcome of that system. And I think that those who are insisting about the emanation of discrimination as a consequence of the transplantation of Indians abroad, who also have to rely on the conception of the caste system, are facing similar problems, which is why a lot of their rhetoric, once you cut beneath the surface, seems so empty, because they also don't know of what they talk, in a way, I would say. And it's very easy on many grounds, the kind of fallacies that are entailed by the descriptions that they provide or the claims that they make are so many. And actually, in the papers that I shared with at least, I hope some of you received them, I actually try to elaborate the kinds of fallacies that are at play in making the kinds of claims and attributing certain events to the caste system, which many people do make, but I think they just can't take them beyond a certain level, because beyond a certain rhetorical level, because their ideas are so weakly grounded. Their basic conceptions are so weakly grounded. So that would be a kind of response to that point. And I think the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination is having the same problem, actually. They're barking up the wrong tree, as the Brits would say.
It's the problem. Yes. I don't know if anyone have any question to ask. Professor, I think that you are tired to answer our demands, and I would like to.
I don't mind. I actually don't mind at all. Yeah, thank you very much. It's been very nice.
I'd like to thank you for your lecture and for sharing with us your thoughts. It was a wonderful pleasure to hear from you. Not just to read you, that it's a pleasure as well. Thank you, Professor. Thank you all for listening and for being here. And I wish you a good night and hope to see you in our next events. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thanks for hosting us.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.